Professor Mikael Stenmark, who is Head of Department and Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the Department of Theology, Uppsala University in Sweden. He has had a distinguished career thus far, and still very young, and he received the John Templeton Foundation Prize for Outstanding Books in 1996, and in 1998 the Uppsala University's Oscar Prize. He is concerned in his current research with theories about human nature, both from science and theology, and he's been very involved with the dialogue between science and theology and written some very significant books, one on scientism that he's going to talk to us about now, and another one, How to Relate Science and Religion, a Multidimensional Approach. And I must say that's one of the best books I've read on science and religion recently, so it really is great, and it's a tremendous privilege to have Mikael with us, fly from Sweden to come and talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. The topic today will be the fallacy of scientism as a worldview, and I will qualify that a little bit as we go along. Let me start anyway by giving you a quotation. Science is the religion of our era, where once we expected priests to give us insights into the nature of cosmos and of human existence, now we look rather to men and sometimes to women in white lab coats. Where once public expenditure in the service of deeper truth might have taken the form of mighty cathedrals, today it will be found in cyclotrons and gene sequencers. Now, the overwhelming intellectual and practical success of science have led some people to think that there are no real limits to the competence of science, no limits to what can be achieved in the name of science. There is nothing outside the domain of science, nor is there any area of human life to which science cannot successfully be applied. A scientific account of anything and everything constitutes the full story of the universe and its inhabitants. Or, if there are limits to the scientific enterprise, the idea is that science at least sets the boundaries for what we humans can ever know about reality. This is the view of scientism. The historical roots of scientism can probably be traced to the Enlightenment with its ideology of progress and perfectibility. Perhaps its most well-known historical advocate is the French social philosopher Auguste Comte, who was born in 1998 and died in 1859, and his attempt to create a religion based on science, the religion of humanity. Another interesting and far-going attempt to have science take over many of the functions of religion, and thus itself become a religion, was undertaken by the German chemist and Nobel Prize winner William Oswald. He argues for science as an Ersatzreligion, a substitute religion. Yet many different forms of scientists have emerged over the last 3 centuries. During the last decades, a number of distinguished natural scientists, for instance, Peter Atkins, Richard Dawkins, Carl Sagan, Edward O. Wilson, as well as philosophers like Daniel D. Dennett, Patricia Churchland, have advocated scientism in one form or another. These scientists and philosophers, besides receiving a number of prestigious prizes and awards, have sold an enormous number of books. The views of these scholars have been discussed in newspapers and have been broadcasted on radio and television. If scientism has been around for a while, the great impact these advocates of scientism have had on popular Western culture is new. They have brought not only science, but also scientism right into the living room of ordinary people. Now, what I want to do in this lecture is to give you an overview of different kinds of scientism. Not all forms of scientism that I think one can detect, but a few of them. And I will also try to convince you that scientism, at least in some of its form, is a kind of religion, and is also a religion worth taking seriously. In particular, I want to focus on scientism and the question about the scope of scientific and human knowledge. I shall argue that scientism is a problematic position to take, one that in the end we ought to reject, or, as I will qualify, at least in some forms, we ought to reject it. Now, let me give you some recent examples of spokespersons of scientism, so you get a flavor of the kinds of ideas that would count as some form of scientism or another. This is Daniel C. Dennett. He writes, "Darwin's dangerous ideas, evolution by natural selection, bears an unmistakable likeness to universal acid. It eats through just about every traditional concept and leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview, with most of the old landmarks still recognizable, but transformed in a fundamental way. Darwin's dangerous idea is reductionism incarnate, promising to unite and explain just about everything in one magnificent vision. The biologist Richard Alexander talks about the most recent discoveries in evolutionary biology as the greatest intellectual revolution of the 20th century. He claims, just like Dennett, that these insights will have a profound impact on our self-view, to such an extent, and I quote him here, that we will have to start all over again to describe and understand ourselves in terms alien to our intuitions. Richard Dawkins, as you all know, living in Great Britain, is equally, if not more optimistic when it comes to what modern biology can deliver. He claims that we no longer, and I quote him here again, no longer have to resort to superstition when faced with the deep problems. Is there a meaning to life? What are we for? What is man? According to him, science, and in particular biology, is capable of dealing successfully with all of these questions. In his essay, The Limitless Powers of Science, Peter Atkins, professor of chemistry in the University of Oxford, advocates the omnicompetence of science and believes that science will, with its currently successful pursuit of universal competence, should be acknowledged king. Lastly, Patricia Churchland writes, in the idealized long run, the completed science is a true description of reality. There is no other truth and no other reality. For a philosopher of religion, like myself, these ideas about science as a universal acid, which eats through just about everything, as a complete explanation, or as an answer to our existential question, even as the king of all, are very fascinating. These ideas are fascinating to me because here the traditional borderline between science and religion is erased. The scientific project becomes a religious or a worldview project. What can help humanity solve its sorrows and problems is science. Let us put our trust in science because it can save us from evil. But what is scientism more exactly? Now, it's not easy to define it, but we could say that someone is an advocate of scientism if he or she believes that everything, or at least as much as possible, could and should be understood in terms of science. Now, here it's very important that we understand that science is interpreted in a very narrow way. I mean, what we're talking about is the natural sciences. It's not Wissenschaft or in Swedish Vetenskap or anything else. It's the narrow sense of science that it's all about. And it's also that thing that makes it, I think, problematic in the end to hold this view. Now, it's assumed that it's something problematic, inferior, or even irrational about the activities or enterprises that could not be understood in such a way as a part of the natural sciences. In the demon-haunted world, science is the candle in the dark. Its mission is to spread the light of science to the pagans, to the unenlightened. So there's a form of a mission of a scientific faith, at least in some of its forms. Another concept that I think is very useful to use in this context is scientific expansionism. And in a sense, it's a better term, and that's what I use in my most recent book on how to relate science and religion, because it's perhaps not such a negative word, and it explains quite well what it's all about. The idea is pretty much that, well, at a particular time, this is what science is. And then you have people that believe that the boundaries of science can be expanded much further out. So much more could be included in the scientific practice. So that would be a form of scientific expansionism. You expand the boundaries of science, and there is no real limit to it, at least according to some people. So here it is. So the most comprehensive view, the most optimistic view could be called comprehensive scientism. And that would be the view that science has no real boundaries. That is, that eventually it will answer all our questions, all our empirical, all our theoretical, practical, moral, and existential questions. Science will in due time solve all genuine problems humankind encounter. Now, how exactly the boundaries of science should be expanded, and what more precisely it is that's to be included within science, are issues on which there is disagreement. Some promoters of scientism are more ambitious in their extension of the boundaries of science than others. That is to say, there are all scientific expansionists, but in different way and to different extent. Perhaps the most well-known form of scientism expresses a particular idea about the boundaries of knowledge. And it says that only science can give us genuine, in contrast to apparent knowledge of reality. In short, the only kind of knowledge we can have is scientific knowledge. So it's an epistemological view about the limits of knowledge. Now, it follows from this that everything outside science is taken as a matter of mere belief or subjective opinions. Consequently, the agenda is to strive to incorporate as many other areas of human life within the sciences as possible, so that rational consideration and acquisition of knowledge can be made possible in these fields as well. If one holds this epistemological view, then it's of course not difficult to understand that one believes that everything, or at least as much as possible, could and should be understood in terms of science. Because what we cannot understand and explain in terms of science is something we cannot know anything about at all. I sometimes call advocates of scientism for science believers. The reason why is not that I want to make a contrast between what we believe and what we know, indicating that these people only believe these things, they don't really know them. No, the reason is rather that I want to highlight the belief in rather than the belief that aspect of belief. The point is that these people put their faith in science, they put their trust in science, they rely on science. Science is, in Paul Tillich's terminology, the famous theologian, their ultimate concern. When science fulfills a particular task in people's life, it becomes their religion in a functional sense. When science is what guides them in their life, is what helps them to deal with their existential and moral questions, then science becomes their religion. They become science believers. So the first answer why we should understand scientism, at least in some of its form, as a religion, is that science in these people's life fulfill a similar function as traditional religion does in the life of religious believers. The second reason is that some of them explicitly claim that science could and should replace traditional religions. Edward O. Wilson, a retired professor of biology at Harvard University, is perhaps the best recent example of someone claiming that science could, it actually must replace traditional religion. He does not call his view for scientism, but scientific naturalism, or sometimes scientific humanism, and sometimes scientific materialism. Wilson believes that scientific naturalism, one of the terms he's using, presents the human mind with an alternative mythology that until now has always, point for point in zones of conflict, defeated traditional religion. He also adds that the best scientific theory to base one's scientific methodology or religion on is evolutionary theory. The evolutionary epic is probably the best myth we will ever have. But let us nevertheless ask whether scientific naturalism satisfies the requirements for being a religion or a worldview or a view of life, as I sometimes call it, whether it fulfill that particular or could fulfill that particular function in human life. I have argued elsewhere in my book on rationality that for something to be a view of life or a worldview or a religion in the functional sense, it must satisfy certain requirements. Is scientism or scientific naturalism able to do this? A view of life must fulfill, as I see it, at least two tasks. The first task is that it must structure and make reality intelligible, and that is the theoretical function of a view of life or a worldview. That is, it must to some degree make the world a cosmos and determine the place of human beings in it, and also state what is of value in life. Second, a view of life or a worldview must concretely guide people in how they should live their lives, how they should deal practically with their existential experiences, for instance, of meaningless, suffering, guilt, and love, and their interpersonal relationship with other human beings. And that is the regulative function of a view of life or a regulative function of a worldview. This is so because believing in a view of life is not just a matter of seeing the world in a particular way, but also a matter of choosing a particular way of living. Scientific naturalism is able to fulfill the theoretical task. It can provide its adherents with a map of reality. It can tell us where human beings fit in, and also, according to Wilson, what the central values of our existence are. It is less certain whether scientific naturalism can concretely regulate people's lives in the way traditional religions have been able to do. And Wilson himself seems to be aware of this problem. He writes that, and I quote him here, "The fatal deterioration of the myths of traditional religion has led to a loss of moral consensus, a great sense of helplessness about the human condition, and a shrinking of concern back toward the self and the immediate future." Scientific naturalism must face this challenge. It must supply people with a new myth, powerful enough to overcome these destructive consequences of the deterioration of traditional religious myths. It must be able to provide a faith by which people actually could live, not only with a theoretical map. Wilson thus suggests that a modification of traditional scientific humanism through the recognition that the mental processes of religious belief represent programmed predispositions whose self-sufficient component were incorporated into the neural apparatus of the brain by thousands of generations of genetic evolution. As such, they are powerful, ineradicable, and at the center of human social existence. I suggest that scientific materialism must accommodate them on two levels: as a scientific puzzle of great complexity and interest, and as a source for energies that can be shifted in new directions when scientific materialism itself is accepted as the more powerful mythology. However, it's not possible, according to Wilson, to predict the form religious life and rituals will take as scientific materialism appropriates the mythopoetic energies to its own ends. Wilson also admits that here lay at least the present spiritual weakness of scientific naturalism. It lacks the primal source of power that religion for genetic reason is hooked up with, partially because the evolutionary epic denies immortality to the individual and divine privilege to the society. Moreover, scientific naturalism will never enjoy the hot pleasures of spiritual conversion and self-surrendering. Scientists cannot, in all honesty, serve as priests. These are the words of Wilson. But Wilson nevertheless believes that a way exists to divert the power of religion into the service of scientific naturalism, even if the future will have to tell us how exactly this will be done. So, it is clear that for some people, like Wilson, science is a kind of religion, and they also believe that science should be the religion we all should adopt. There is a missionary incentive involved here. So it seems as if scientific naturalism and scientism can be, or at least have the potential, to become a full-fledged religion, even if it would lack some of the attributes of traditional religions. Now, I want to now move over and discuss the question about the limits of human knowledge. So let me now focus more closely on one particular form of scientism, namely epistemic scientism, and the issue about the scope of scientific and human knowledge. Atkins, in his argument for the limitless power of science, claims that there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious hope that there is a dark corner of the physical universe, or of the universe of experience, that science can never hope to illuminate. Thomas Nagel, agnostic philosophers, disagree though. He rather thinks that this, what he calls overuse of science to explain everything and anything that Atkins exemplifies, has to do with a fear of religion. That is, one wanting atheism or naturalism to be true and hoping that there is no God, but being made uneasy by the fact that many intelligent and well-informed people are religious believers. This fear of religion, or what he also calls the cosmic authority problem, is not a rare condition, and Nagel's guess is that it's responsible for much of the scientism and reductionism of our time. Now, be that as it may, just wanted to mention that, and these are the words of Nagel that he's written in the book called The Last Word, if you're interested to look at it. Do we have any reason to doubt the omnicompetence of science, that science tells us, or eventually will tell us, everything there is to know about reality? I think there's been developed two different strategies in an attempt to undermine scientism that you can find within the at the university or the academy today. Now, one is I would call a postmodern relativist strategy, and the other one is what I would call a rationalist or multi-knowledge strategy. I will mention both of these, and I will in particular try to develop the second one, but I will exemplify the first one anyway. So the first kind of strategy is to argue that all scientific theories are merely social constructions. Which theory prevails at any time is just a matter of who has the power and what is in fashion. There is no objective truth to be found in science. What is true about scientific theories is also, of course, true about scientism, the greatest meta-narrative of them all. Paul Saulson is a scientist who identified this kind of criticism against scientific knowledge claim, and also, though, by extension, against epistemic scientism. And this is what he writes: I believe in the church of science. We scientists fit the profile of true believers who are convinced we have privileged access to the truth, and who are confused about and suspicious of people who want to treat our belief system as a social phenomena. And I think what he means here is merely a social phenomenon, because it's quite obvious that it is a social phenomenon. But it's the merely thing that makes it perhaps a little bit more problematic. But that's a kind of criticism. Now, I also want to give you one example of this kind of criticism, even though I don't want to develop it much more. We can come back to that in the discussion if you're interested in. And the example I will give you is from a radical feminist point of view, but there's a number of other ways you can develop this as well. And it's Julie Hopkins that writes as follows. Traditionally in the patriarchal West, truth has been considered an objective reality to be deduced through reason and then tested empirically. Elite councils of man who wield power in church or science or politics have claimed that their objectivity is God-given, corresponding with metaphysical laws. Sharon Welch, another radical feminist writer, argued that this understanding of knowledge, far from being value-free, is a strategy undertaken in order to dominate. For so-called objective reality is in fact laden with the presuppositions and prejudices of those who hold hegemonies of power and who project these onto a fiction or tabula rasa. Welch agrees with the French philosopher Michel Foucault that Westerners should give up the pretension of speaking in universal dogmatic categories and recognize that a just and peaceful future lies with a new epistemology, which she names, Welsh names, the political economy of truth, in which every group, class, race, sex, and religion has the right to name for themselves what is true and liberating. Now, this is a form of criticism that is directed, of course, against the idea of an objective science and objective reality and so forth. But of course, if it is true, then it also would undermine scientism. That is one strategy that one can use. I want to develop a different kind of strategy, the strategy that I call the rationalist multi-knowledge strategy. The basic idea is that I want to grant that science gives us knowledge of reality, but argue that it's merely one kind of knowledge that is possible for us to obtain, and that these other forms of genuine knowledge cannot be reduced to scientific knowledge. What is seriously problematic about epistemic scientism is that it is, in fact, self-refuting. That is, it undermines itself. Epistemic scientism states that all genuine knowledge is scientific knowledge. It follows from this claim that we cannot know that scientific knowledge is the only mode of knowledge unless we are able to determine this by scientific means. This is so because science is the only source of knowledge that we can have, according to scientism. But what methods in, for instance, biology, physics, are suitable for such a task of showing that the only kind of knowledge that we can have is scientific knowledge? Well, hardly those methods that makes it possible for scientists to discover and explain electrons, protons, genes, survival mechanisms, and natural selection. The reason why is not that the content of this belief is too small, too distant, or too far in the past for science to determine its truth value. Rather, is that beliefs of this sort are not subject to scientific inquiry. The belief that only science can give us knowledge about reality is a view in the theory of knowledge, and is therefore a piece of philosophy and not a piece of science. But then, epistemic scientism is self-refuting. It undermines itself. This is so because if the belief that only science can give us knowledge about reality is a philosophical standpoint, then it follows that we can never know that it is true, because the belief itself says that the only kind of knowledge we can have is scientific knowledge. The only way around this problem is to try to reformulate the scientific stance, but is that possible? Now, the answer appears to be yes, and I think that Atkins can give us some help here. If we look at one of the things that he is writing. The attitude, and this is the way he wants to express what I would call his form of scientism, the attitude that I advocate is that the omnicompetence of science, and in particular the simplicity its reductionist insight reveals, should be accepted as a working hypothesis, until, if ever, it is proven inadequate. But why should we accept this as a working hypothesis? The answer that Atkins hints at is that science has been tremendously successful. It has given us insights about nature that people could only have dreamt about a couple of centuries ago. It is the success story of science that justifies the scientific attitude. It is true that we cannot prove that all genuine knowledge is scientific knowledge, but we could and should take this as a working hypothesis because of the success story of science. So other kinds of knowledge might exist. This soft-core scientism, as I shall call it, does not, in contrast to the previous hardcore scientism, deny that. It rather wants to place the burden on proof of those who claim that there exist other kinds of knowledge than scientific knowledge. So softcore scientism merely maintains that we should be suspicious of all human knowledge claims that are not scientific, and which apparently cannot be reduced to scientific knowledge claims. This form of scientism appears not to be self-refuting. It does not entail that we know that all genuine knowledge is scientific knowledge, and thus face the impossible task of explaining how this knowledge could be obtained by scientific means. It advocates would rather maintain that this is a belief, a rational belief, or a justified working hypothesis. It is justified or rational because of the success story of science. Let us, for the sake of argument, assume then that the burden of proof falls on those who believe that there are other forms of knowledge than the scientific kind. Are there things that it's reasonable to assume that we know which are not scientifically knowable? What kind of other valid epistemological activities are there besides science? Recall then and remember that science is understood in a quite narrow sense here. I shall claim that the record of scientific success is enough to justify us to believe that science, by and large, gets at the truth about the world, and therefore generates knowledge. But it justifies no more than that because there are other reliable forms of knowledge. Scientific knowledge even presupposes the existence of some of these other kinds of knowledge. And it's quite easy for us to forget that, but I will want to try to make that explicit so you can see it as well. If we did not know certain things already, we would not be able to obtain any scientific claim and any scientific knowledge at all. And that is part of the claim I'm going to make here. So, what do we need to know to be able to do science? Now, I just want to highlight a few things that I think are necessary. Several other of these things are emphasized in my book on scientism, so you can read that if you're interested. Now, suppose I'm like Darwin, thinking about why a new species come into existence and an old one exit from the scene. In this particular case, I observe a herd of zebras in which there seems to be variation of running speed. I formulate the thought that perhaps the running speed is inherited and that it makes a difference to survival and reproduction. And of course, I'm fully aware that I'm having these thoughts. We could call this kind of knowledge about my thoughts for introspective knowledge. Not only do I have introspective knowledge, that is knowledge about what I'm thinking of, but it seems like it's more certain than scientific knowledge. I am more certain that I have this thought than that the running speed is inherent and that it makes a difference to the survival of and reproductions of zebras. It makes no sense to question my belief that I'm now thinking about the running speed of zebras by asking, for instance, Michael, are you certain about this? Is it not rather the case that you're thinking about food? This, however, is a reasonable question when it comes to my ideas about the running speed, whether it's inherent or not. What grounds do I have for claiming those things? Secondly, I must know that I have these kinds of thoughts about the running speed to be able to do science at all. If I cannot know that I have this thought, that I'm now thinking about the running speed of zebras, how am I going to be able to develop complex theories about the relationship between variation, fitness, and heritability? That does not seem to be possible. But not only do I have to know that I have these thoughts to do science, to have introspective knowledge, I must also over a period of time remember that I have had these thoughts, as well as all the observations I have made about the running speed of individual zebras. So to be able to develop and test scientific hypotheses against a certain range of data, scientists have to be able to remember, for instance, the content of the hypothesis, the previous test results, and more fundamentally, that there are scientists and where their laboratories are located. Their scientific knowledge presupposes knowledge based on memory. But could not introspective knowledge and knowledge based on memory be reduced to scientific knowledge? No, because if scientific knowledge presupposes introspective knowledge and knowledge based on memory, then you first have to know these things to be able to do science. Reduction of the former to the latter is therefore not possible. Moreover, it does not seem reasonable to reduce knowledge claims that are more certain to knowledge claims that are less certain. I also want to argue that knowledge about social reality is something that science cannot give us. And it's a kind of knowledge few of us would on reflection deny that we have. In fact, I think that there are so many things we know and that we bring into doing science, and we tend to forget all these things when we start doing science. But let me give you one example of what I mean when I'm talking about knowledge of the social world. And I'm not talking about the social sciences here. I'm just talking about common sense knowledge or everyday knowledge. So this is the example. Suppose I go into a cafe in Stockholm and sit in a chair at a table. The waiter comes and I utter the fragment of a Swedish sentence. I say, "Kan jag få en öl, tack?" The waiter brings the beer and I drink it. I read a book and notice a Coca-Cola sign on the wall and a car outside the window. I leave some money on the table and leave. Now this sounds simple, but as John Searle, in particular, and others have pointed out, its metaphysical complexity is truly staggering. And its significant features, I would claim, fall outside of science in this narrow sense. Notice that we cannot capture the features of the description I just have given in the language of physics or chemistry or any other of the natural sciences. There is no physical chemical description adequate to define cafe, waiter, sentence in Sweden, money, or even chair or table, even though cafe, waiter, money, chairs, and tables are physical phenomena. Since no physical chemical description can be given of these social phenomena, no scientific knowledge in this restricted sense of the social world seems to exist. But we know these things. A large chunk of our knowledge is of the social world we inhabit. So, to exemplify again, where science only can see masses of metal in linear trajectories, we can see a car. Where science only can see cellulose fibers with green and gray stains, we can see dollar bills. Moreover, I do not merely order a beer to drink, I'm also reading a book in which is written, the only kind of knowledge we can have is scientific knowledge. Now, to put it bluntly, can science read books? Or for simplicity, these two sentences? The first one, the only kind of knowledge we can have is scientific knowledge. And the other one is drink Coca-Cola, and thus obtain linguistic knowledge. More precisely, the question is whether, for example, the biologist qua biologist or the physicist qua physicist can read these texts. Can they, as scientists, discover or come to know the meaning of these sentences by applying solely the methods of biology or physics? Well, scientists can, of course, analyze the chemical laws that allow ink to bound with paper and the other things that make it possible to write these sentences. But can scientists with these methods come to know the information contained in these sentences? I must admit that I cannot even imagine what such an experiment would look like. Now, let us go back to the cafe again. After I have read this sentence in the book, I shake my head and look up and notice, once again, the Coca-Cola sign on the wall of the cafe. But then I suddenly realize that I do not merely know that it's written drink Coca-Cola on the billboard sign, but I also know that someone is actually trying to convince me to buy a particular product. Hence, I come to the conclusion that I have both linguistic knowledge and what you could perhaps call intentional knowledge. That is, knowledge about people's intentions and purposes. But once again, this knowledge about that someone is trying to convince me to buy a particular project is not a form of natural science knowledge. So, contrary to what Atkins thinks, we have every reason to believe that the world is bigger than the world of the natural sciences, and that we can obtain knowledge about this bigger world that cannot be reduced to scientific knowledge. Some of this knowledge seems even to be more certain than the knowledge that is produced by science. Now, what I wanted to do then is not really to give you some definition of what knowledge is and say, well, here are some other kinds of forms of knowledge. What I wanted to give you is examples of things that I think all of us would agree that we know. And on reflection, I think we also would understand that these things are things we have to know to be able to do science. And in that sense, it helps us understand that there is a limit to, or in fact, that kind of scientism that Atkins and others wants to advocate fails. Now, the picture I want to give you at the end here is a little bit an idea about how the things I've said would fit in, and it would also give you a chance to think about your own ideas here as a kind of metaphysical map of reality. So I would say that on the one hand, we have the mental world, and we were talking about thoughts, emotions, memories, intentions, and so forth. And here are two of the claims that I would say that many of us would say these are things that we know, and I wouldn't want to say that they're actually scientific knowledge claims. I know that I'm now thinking about scientism. I know that I had breakfast this morning. And then we do have the physical world: zebras, stones, electrons, genes, black holes, etc. And here are some examples. I know that the running speed of animals is inherited. I know that genes are segments of chromosomes. And then we have the social world that is such a big part of what we're doing, but we sometimes not think about it, perhaps other than when we're trying to learn a foreign language. And this word gets problematic sometimes. We have money, we have restaurants, we have billboard signs, we have governments, we have legal laws, and so forth. And there's a lot of chunk of knowledge that we have that belong to this, and it's a chunk of knowledge that we had long before science even developed, or what we now would want to call science. I know that this person is a waiter. I know that it's written "drink Coca-Cola" on this billboard sign, and that someone is trying to convince me to buy a particular product. I know that this piece of paper is money. And we have knowledge, a lot of knowledge of that kind. Now, then we come to two other areas that some people think are more problematic. The first one I would just want to call the moral world, and here we talk about properties like evil, good, virtue, abuse, oppression, etc. And here are examples of knowledge claim that you can think about whether you would say I know these things or not. I know that it's wrong to torture children. I know that Stalin was an evil person. And then we're thinking about the religious elements of the world. You can call that the transcendental world, gods, nirvana, spirits, and so forth. And you have knowledge claim of the form that I know that God exists. I know that God is love. I know that people are created in the image of God. Now, what I've been trying to do then is to tell you a little bit about what scientism is. I've also been criticizing a particular form of scientism, namely the idea that the only kind of knowledge we can have is scientific knowledge. But, and I think that's important, that doesn't mean that all forms of scientism should be rejected, and therefore it might be better sometimes to switch and talk about scientific expansionism. Because a lot of the discussion today is, for instance, that I would classify as a form of scientific expansionism. That is the people in biology, for instance, that want to expand the biological theories into the social sciences, into the humanities, that thinks that there are important insights within biological theory, within evolutionary theory, that could be applied. Now, I mean that these claims are things that we couldn't a priori say, no, that won't work. I mean, I think in any such case, science might, the harder part of science might be able to expand, and we don't know that beforehand whether it can expand or not. So on issues of that kind, I don't think you can rely on what I've done now, philosophical arguments saying, well, hey, you're inconsistent, or you give some concrete example of different forms of knowledge. That is something you really have to sit down and read through and see, is it the case that what we need today is a Darwinian social scientists that apply that kind of theory to the social sciences or to the humanities? And that's a discussion you have to go through. To what extent could evolutionary theories also be a resource when it comes to religious studies or scientific study of religion or theology? There's nothing you could say beforehand. So in that sense, I think there is a form in which scientism is a fallacy, and that is, I think, in the epistemological sense. The idea that we don't now know where the boundaries of science are and that we might be able to expand that is something we have to investigate whenever we get a new theory out. We have to look at the data, we have to do it quite carefully. In that sense, I don't think you could directly say that scientism is not an appropriate attitude to take. But since scientism have such a negative connotations, it might therefore sometimes we better to talk about scientific expansionism, expanding what science at a particular time is, and that's something I want to emphasize tomorrow. I mean, science isn't what it isn't given. It could be expanded, it could be smaller. You never know. You just have to look at the different time periods that we are involved with. Perhaps what we've gone through is through a very expand model where everything was included, and then we're developed towards in the heydays of positivism where it was very, very narrow, and perhaps now it's expanding again. These are things that we don't know, and we couldn't say immediately that that's not an appropriate development of science. Science is a social practice, and it develops, and religion is a social practice, and it develops, and that's a theme that I will come back to tomorrow. I think I quit there.
Thank you very much indeed. So, scientism, any questions for Professor Stenmark?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's very interesting and something that's close to my heart as well, thinking about that. I think in today's society there are a lot of people who perhaps do follow a form of scientism, and probably just myself looking down at the list of areas of knowledge you were suggesting wouldn't fit into sort of scientism or scientific knowledge. I just look at sort of social knowledge and linguistic knowledge, and certainly they both seem to have sets of patterns or rules, and I think once you have a set of rules, then surely it's possible to form equations or ways of going about things, and that would fit into a scientific sort of knowledge, like Dennis Alexander was saying, that something that's coherent and reproducible fits those sort of criteria of science. So,
right. Yeah. Well, I think I don't think scientism is problematic if you use it in the German sense of the term or in the Swedish sense. I mean, that wouldn't be problematic because these things are around. But it seems that we're having these kinds of knowledge, and we've had that for a long time, and it's tricky to say that these could be reduced to science. It just seems that to be able to become a scientist, you have to learn to read. I mean, it's just certain things you just have to know and to be able to do to get into that kind of enterprise. And for me, I think one important thing here is also that scientific knowledge for me is typically a form of indirect knowledge. It's not a direct knowledge. I mean, there's a lot of things we know immediately. I'm just looking out here and I see all of you. Science typically isn't of that kind. Science is more like, I'm looking, there's nobody, well, let's suppose we're outside and there is nobody there, and I just see on the ground that there's snow there and there's steps in the snow, and on the basis of the steps I see in the snow, I make a conclusion that there's been somebody walking past here. And I think that's the kind of form that scientific knowledge is. It's not, I wouldn't even want to say that observational knowledge, that I see a tree, I see a taxi, whatever, is anything that is really scientific. Because if that's it, then we would all be scientists. Science is something that you need a special training for, and something that not everyone can get hold of, and therefore it's a kind of different form of knowledge than many of these other things that we immediately can see. And I just think there's a tendency to think that everything is scientific, and I just don't see how that would apply in this case. There's so many things you just have to know before you start that particular project of becoming a scientist. But I don't want, again, I don't think you should be, and perhaps I must criticize myself, though, you shouldn't be, there might be some of these things that you could develop scientific knowledge about, but it seems that it wouldn't reduce or take away the other forms of knowledge. And I don't quite know how I would myself think and be justified when I come to the things I think I know, and then a scientist would say, well, that's what you think, but that's not the case. I might believe that I have a self, for instance. And then there's some scientists saying, well, you don't have a self. Well, it's a tricky matter whether I should say, well, are your theories more justified than my belief that I have a self? It's tricky to develop. The only reason why I should accept the scientific claim is if I think that is more basic, more secure, more certain than the other one. And I don't really see how that's going to work out. But yeah, I grant you that I might have to be a little more open-minded in that area as well.
Thank you. to ask.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I wonder whether there is an element of kind of autocracy in the scientism, in the sense that you have to follow us, you have to accept us, until and unless you do that, in the language of Richard Dawkins, either you are unsophisticated or you are child. That means it is kind of just single, homogeneous, one-dimensional worldview, and kind of taking the position of a priest or a preacher that you have to follow us, and you have to accept our worldview.
Yeah.
Unless you do that, you are unsophisticated or child or superstitious, and the problem is that there is no way it is possible to live a meaningful life only with scientific knowledge. I mean, how many scientists or Daniel Richard Dawkins, just to put bluntly, did they ever run, just gene analysis and got to know who was their father? They believed their mother, and mother told that he was their father, and nobody does the gene analysis or fingerprinting to get to know, is it really possible to live a simple life without being crazy?
Yeah.
To live a normal life just with
Right.
one view of the reality?
Right. Well, two comments on that. The first one is, yes, many of them are a little one-dimensional and they so forth. But I also can sometimes see the frustration that natural scientists could have. I mean, in many fields there's been a fair amount of progress. And then you think about, I'm just thinking about Wilson and philosophers, and Wilson is saying that he want to send the philosophers on sabbatical, and they should. And I think the background, I can understand that, well, we have had philosophers trying to develop theories in morality for 2,000 years at least, and we haven't had much progress. Why don't we just send them on sabbatical and let the biologists take it over and then see where we can go? How far we can. I mean, it's in a certain way I can also understand that. I mean, there isn't the same kind of progress when it comes to knowledge. So I think some of them are very narrow-minded and one-dimensional, but I also sometimes feel that they really believe in their own theories, and they just don't want to say that well, maybe we can apply it in this other area as well. And therefore, I just don't want us to be too categorical. I mean, we should be allow them the possibility to see how far they're ready to go. Of course, it's a kind of insult at the same time to say that philosophers should be on sabbaticals. I mean, at least they should be allowed to continue working on their theories. So there's also that flavor in the language that is very problematic, I'm thinking. I'm just saying that it's really bad stuff, everything you've done. So it's a little mixed feeling. So I tend to forget the second point here now. Well, just getting into that.
Is it really
Can they have a
possible
meaningful life?
to live a
So-
meaningful life without being crazy?
Yes. Well, I don't think they always are consistent. I mean, a central part of being a scientist is, of course, to have a skeptical attitude, of course. Now, of course, in every area of life, you couldn't have the same kind of skeptical attitude. Any time my wife come home and tell me some things, some perhaps almost unbelievable things, I just wouldn't have the same attitude that I would perhaps have in the scientific community, right? And saying, well, it's an excellent theory you have there, but I don't believe it until I have the evidence. And she might want to have a divorce, and I might be out of friends if I'm starting to use that attitude. And that's something that also I think that you have to take into account, that science is a certain kind of practice with certain kinds of goals, and you couldn't just apply that in every area of life. So I would agree with you very much. So it's a kind of rationality that I think overlaps, but it's not the rationality of everyday life. It's not the same, and it shouldn't be the same kind all the way as the scientific rationality.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering whether rather than as an overlap, it was more that science was trying to put forward a project of materialism versus the other kinds of knowledge which you could probably bracket under the category of subjective or psychological, in that the other forms of knowledge are all dependent upon us as human beings, and that within that subset as human beings we have coloured things in a particular way. But science is actually providing a more, when you're talking about reductionism, it's actually more of a meta-narrative. I mean, if we were rabbits, we would colour ourselves and certain aspects as rabbits, but, and the human thing is actually perhaps something that science is trying to discount in just providing a materialist view.
Yes, I mean, I think, perhaps you're right there, but it seems to me to be, fairly clear. I have knowledge about the social life that would be crazy to call something else than knowledge, and it would be crazy also to try to reduce them to something of that form that you're now talking. I mean, if you have a more complementary view, you would say, that's the kind of knowledge that the natural sciences can give us. But then we have also this other kind of knowledge. I mean, there is a lot of things about this table that scientists can tell us, but there is also a lot of things that we can know if we're thinking about what a table is and what function it plays in human life. So it's more, the tricky part is when you have these more radical claims, and I just don't think they really have thought the issue through carefully enough. They just, or maybe I don't understand the natural sciences enough. It could also be the case, but it seems to me that there's just tons of knowledge around that we need to be able to do this, to develop the scientific project.
Dennis.
This is just a little bit of a comment really on the question, but I very much like your terminology of scientific expansionism and the way that the flow can go either way, the tide can come in or out, as it were. And I was just thinking particularly, this quotation which you gave us at the beginning of your talk from E.O. Wilson on scientific faith and science believers. It's quite an ambiguous statement, but it has a flavour of a sort of genetic determinism. It could be interpreted in a number of ways. But I was just reflecting, and it was written, I think, in 1978. Now, in a sense, I think this is an interesting example where, the study of science can push the tide back the other way, actually. And, of course, there was a lot of one would say now, quite naive genetic determinism around in the 1970s, based on the thought or the assumption that we had around 100,000 genes. And in a sense, genomics is now we know we only have about 25,000 genes. The scope, therefore, for building in variation between humans, which would be sufficient to explain variation in beliefs, is actually quite low. It's become less plausible. With 25,000 genes, it's difficult to imagine how you would do that job. Right. So I think this is quite an interesting example. And so evolutionary psychology has been pushed back, actually, away from strictly genetic determinism, sort of presentations for most people anyway. I think that's quite a nice example of the way that science itself actually can, as it were, push back scientism. The flow goes a little bit the other way, actually. So I just wanted to flag that.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah. Good comment.
Do you think the impact of scientism in popular culture is increasing or decreasing? It's a fact that most scientists are just a handful of people, Dawkins, Dennett, maybe 10 of them, 10 big names. But, in Hollywood movies and in advertisements and so on, scientism is really pushed onto the society. And I wonder if you have any observations on that. Is the society, modern society, becoming more is it buying into that kind of materialistic worldview, or is there a kind of retreat? What tide is on that?
Well, it's hard. The point I just wanted to make is that these people have with the media, they have a new chance of telling their views, so to say, and they have received a lot of attention. And that's something perhaps new that wasn't the case if you go back. If you go back 100 years to 200 years when people also had scientific views. So that's the only really point I was trying to make. Whether it's expanding in general or not, I don't really know. I remember when it's just a single comment, and you couldn't generalize it, but I just remember when I was trying to help the Environmental Protection Agency in Sweden and with a project about the values involved, and I read through all their documents about how we should treat nature. I just noticed that they had a tendency to always try to write like the language they were using were scientific language, and they weren't upfront with the values. They were typically trying to hide the value components, and it's something that's out in culture that, well, if science can do it, it's so much better than anybody else. So let's try to hide these things. So there is a certain faith in scientists that I think go far beyond what could be justified. And in that sense, it was just trying to hide the value commitments and trying to make everything sound like it was science that we're doing. But that's just a particular instance, and it's hard to make any generalization out of that.
And if I may ask a second question, you mentioned there are two strategies against scientism, and the first one is the postmodern.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you include Thomas Kuhn's paradigm concept into that?
Well, I think Thomas Kuhn isn't quite consistent in his writing. I mean, there is a postmodernist interpretation, and I mean there is a tradition from Kuhn going in that direction, but it's also other things that he's been saying that would go in the other direction. So I don't think it's that easy to classify him one way or another. Really, he's a source for a lot of thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah.
I enjoyed your talk a great deal. I noticed that the roots of scientism you suggest are in the continent, but most of your present authors are Anglo-American.
Yes.
Is it the case that scientism is especially an English language phenomenon, or are there maybe other reasons for your choice? And if there is a connection, is the analytic versus continental philosophy lack of comprehension relevant?
Well, thinking about Sweden, it is problematic when you don't have this narrow word science to use. You know, it's such a helpful thing if you want to argue for scientism of this kind. I mean, I would say you have people of this sort in Sweden as well. It's just that you can't say these things so fast, and so you know you don't really have the terminology. So you find these views, but since the accepted, you always have to say the natural sciences then every time and then people start saying, well, what about these other things? So I think that's part of the answer, but I think you find them everywhere. Yes, you do. But there's different tradition in some European countries that are different from Great Britain, I think, in America.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk. I would like to learn where should we put David Hume in this debate?
David Hume?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Well, that's kind of, I don't know. And that's kind of before we're talking about science. I mean, that's natural philosophy. So I wouldn't want to put him anywhere. I mean, it's anachronistic to try to put him into this kind of schedule. David Hume, yeah. Yeah. So
I wonder if any of our
well, yeah.
philosophers might get that one.
you can ask Ernie McMullen if you want to say Hume have any.
If we pass the microphone then.
I think where Hume is concerned, it entirely depended on the context in which he spoke.
Okay.
As he says himself, if he's speaking in the tavern to his friends, he's a believer.
Right.
If he's writing in his study on the treatise on human knowledge or something like that, he is a skeptic. So his life was really divided. He split his life. It's not unusual in some ways. People do that. But he certainly gave the impression among those among whom he moved, the friends that he enjoyed time with, he did not give the impression to them of being a complete skeptic. And in the Scotland of his own day, it would have been not very good for him to do that. He was highly dependent on public money, And he was doing something that was a bit risky. He was writing a history of the British, of Britain, of the English, well, actually of England. And at the time, England was not exactly popular in Scotland. It was just after the Act of Union, and so his position, politically speaking, in society was a little bit edgy. And so I think to take a strongly anti-religious view would have been disastrous for him publicly. But as long as he confined it to a study, he assumed that the Presbyterians weren't reading his work.
Just a quick comment too on that. I mean, what you miss is a skeptic. I mean, these people, they really think we can know a lot of things. They're epistemological optimists, the whole bunch of them. So in that sense, there's a big difference. I mean, he's from a very skeptical. He doesn't really know, perhaps, if we know anything, or well, very few things. But these people think we can know a lot, and especially if we let the natural sciences take over the arena.
One other comment about Hume in the context of your talk is the last thing in the world he would be a scientist in this sense, a scientistic, because in fact he was the first really true skeptic about science, or at least it was a consequence of his work that I think he was not happy about, but because he took the voluntarist position he did, well, because he took the empiricist position he did post-voluntarist, he did not have, as the early voluntarists had, God to save the world from chaos, basically. And so his world was one in which there was no reason that could be given why one should, in fact, suppose that the world would continue to act as it has. Now, that's an absolute premise of science. I mean, if you have no reason to believe that the regularities of the world will continue, science itself is totally undermined. And so the problem, I mean, he gave to the modern world an unbelief. If you're an unbelieving scientist, you really have the problem of induction. I mean, you really do. There are ways in which it might be met, but it's a very serious problem. And so scientism, in a sense, is undermined by Hume in an odd way, even though it's not as though he's producing a religious alternative by any manner of means. Skepticism is what you end in.
Okay. Good, thank you. Yeah, Dan.
Yes, thank you for your talk. So I noticed that several of the quotations that you gave to illustrate scientism mentioned reductionism. Dennett would also describe himself as a naturalist. And I wondered if you have some thoughts on how scientism, as you're understanding it, would relate to other large-scale views that are popularly defended today, like naturalism or materialism, physicalism, reductionism, and things in the neighborhood. Yeah.
Well, just a quick comment. I mean, it's clear that people like Kai Nielsen, for instance, hold a form of naturalism that is not of this kind. I mean, he's clear about that there are limits to scientific knowledge. So his form of naturalism would not be, I would say, a scientific form of naturalism. It would be more like I perhaps would call philosophical naturalism. So he's quite clear about that science can't do it all for us. So in that sense, I think there is an important difference between different forms of naturalism. So yeah, that would be the quick answer, yes. Okay. Time is running here.
Yeah, one more.
I was impressed years ago by reading Stanley Jakey's book, The Relevance of Physics, which concludes with a section on scientism. Okay. You might like to comment whether that's a valuable piece of writing or not. But clearly he doesn't just regard it as a fallacy, as a philosophical error, but as a dangerous idea, to borrow Dennett. Maybe you can comment on that. My real question is it possible to, if you like, be passionately pro-science and clearly against scientism? As a practical thing, I would like to be definitely pro-science, but to be able to refute and argue against scientism, not to be...
I think it is. And I think some of the people that have been very critical against science what they're really critical against is scientism, actually. I mean, if you look at some people involved in the environmental movement and some of the postmodern thinkers and so on, I think that's really what, and also some of the fundamentalists in the States, I think it's really the scientism that's bothering them, and they can't really make a distinction between scientism and science. So I think it's extremely important to try to do that, to try to make that distinction, and the easiest way to do it is, of course, to when you write, say, of course, that there are other forms of knowledge, but we want to expand also scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is important, so there are other forms of knowledge. I mean, as long as you add these kinds of qualifications in what you're writing and what you're saying, I don't think anybody would think you're arguing for scientism. So you could still have a very strong faith in science, and also think that it can actually get into some new areas. So I think it's possible. It's just when you never have these kinds of qualifications when you talk and when you write, then you end up with problems, I think.
I think perhaps one more question, and then we can have our break and our 5-minute break and resume with Professor True. So, yeah.
It's not just a question, but scientism sounds like communism for me, like socialism, and that is kind of parallel. That is kind of worship to something made by human beings. So we show which is the result when someone makes a religion such kind of view, and I just wanted to point that it is.
Yeah.
I lived in such country, excuse me.
Yes.
And
yes.
yeah, exactly. We that was really in socialism that we believed only in that what science proved. That was one of the rules. If something is not proved by science, that doesn't exist.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the case. But of course, if you're looking at communism, many of the things they were saying weren't able to be proven by science. So I mean, that was a part of the rhetorical claims. But other than that, of course, it's a kind of, perhaps one should phrase it in this way, and maybe that's something very interesting with Wilson. And it seems like Wilson is thinking that the religious instinct, so to say, is hardwired into us. It's just there, and you just have to have some new kind of substitute. And it could be an ideology like communism, or it could be a form of worldview like scientism, or it could be some kind of traditional religion, or some new age, or whatever it is. But perhaps there's something that is inherent in us, that we have a certain need, we have a religious instinct that we somehow have to take into account. And that's what I sometimes found interesting with Wilson, that he really thinks it's necessary that somebody replace it, but he doesn't believe in communism or socialism. That wouldn't work. So the only hope for him is that science take over the role here.
Do you think that is religion exactly, because they don't have fear from anything?
No, it's not religion in the traditional sense. It's religion in the functional sense of being something that provides you with meaning, that helps you deal with your existential question, that helps you understand what is valuable in life and so forth. So in that more functional sense, it's a religion, but not in the traditional sense that you're thinking that some transcendental dimension is part of it, that there is a God or so forth. No, not in that sense, but in a more functional sense.
Thank you. I think we'd better stop because we're in reasonable time at the moment. So if we resume in 5 minutes, we'll still have